Welcome to video 4 of chapter 15, and we will explore challenges to positive child development, beginning with poverty. So as it says here, UNICEF in 2005 described poverty as the single most indicator of a child's well-being. In the US, more than 15 million children live in poverty, which is a rate much higher than in any other industrialized nation. And yet, we are a very rich country. I mean, we have a rate higher than any other industrialized nation, and yet, are considered, certainly one of the richest countries in the world, and we have 1 in 5 U.S. children living in poverty. I mean, it still blows my mind when I think about it, how we could have so many children living in poverty and with so much wealth in this country. Maybe we just need to spread around the money a little bit more. Okay, let's go continue here. Black and Hispanic children are the groups most likely to live in poverty. In all racial and ethnic groups, children under the age of 5 are more likely than older children to live in poverty. And this is significant because children do worse if they live in poverty early in their childhood rather than later. And, if you've been following this class all term, then you should know why. Because, remember early on, is neural wiring in the brain and in physical structures that are still developing at a faster rate early in childhood. And because they're developing, in the process of developing, they're therefore more vulnerable to the effects of negative experiences. So the more set our brains become as we age and develop and become old, older children and then adolescents, there are less aspects of our brain that are still developing. And so they become less vulnerable to outside influences, the brains I'm talking about. And so because there's such rapid development early in life, the negative environmental effects can really affect the way the brain develops. So younger children are more vulnerable living in poverty before the age of 5 than older children. And yet, those are the ones that are most likely to be in poverty. All right, children are also more likely to live in poverty if they live in a single-parent household. Okay. There's a whole list here of risks associated with poverty. I'm just going to read through them quickly. Lack of adequate health services and poor nutrition can contribute to prenatal problems and premature birth. So it can start affecting the child even before they're born. High rates of depression in parents. Parents provide less stimulation to the children. Parental discipline is often more punitive and harsh. It's more likely that the child will be exposed to family violence. It's more likely the child is growing up in a dangerous neighborhood. And the list continues. More risk of cognitive disability and developmental delay, more risk of academic challenges, more risk of physical and other health-related problems, and also more risk of behavioral problems. So it's a long list of effects of living in poverty as a child. The longer children live in poverty, the worse their outcomes. So it is a cumulative effect. It's let's say one child continuously lives in poverty while another child moves in and out of poverty, which is not uncommon. Sometimes there's a back and forth kind of a cycle that develops in in some families where they have money, like perhaps more money during certain parts of the year, and they move out of, and they've like risen above poverty, and then for other parts of the year they're below poverty because, because of things like seasonal work, for instance. Um, and anyway, so what I want to say is that, if a child's moving in and out of poverty, that's not as bad as being continuously in poverty. It's at least helpful that sometimes they're out of poverty. So it's the total amount of time that determines, the risk of damage. In addition to raising family income, other factors that may help include positive parenting relationships and attending early education programs, such as Head Start programs. Um, they can be very helpful to young children that are growing up in poverty circumstances. Um, Head Start's a national program for disadvantaged youngsters. It's a preschool program that helps prepare the children from disadvantaged families, particularly if they live in poverty, helps prepare them for formal schooling. Uh, Also, I want to mention this study. This was in the mid 1990s, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development began an experiment called the Moving to Opportunity Program. And what they did was they gave housing vouchers to 4,600 random high poverty families, which allowed them to move to better neighborhoods. So they randomly chose 4,600 families in poverty, allowing them to move to better neighborhoods. And the results were that the children ended up being more likely to attend college. The children they ended up earning more as young adults if they were part of this program. They were less likely to become single parents. But this only held true for children that were five or under when the family was moved to a better neighborhood. So that's significant, showing that moving to a better neighborhood and better house. It only helped those under five because once again, it's the damage that's done often occurs early in life. And so if it was an older child and they moved to a better neighborhood, I mean, sure, that's good for the older child, but at that point, the damage of growing up in poverty had already been done. So even though their life improved somewhat, they didn't show these effects that I mentioned, being more likely to attend college or earning more as young adults or less likely to become single parents. So we just show that you have to intervene early, while children are still young. The ones that were under five benefited from their family, moving to a new neighborhood, whereas the ones that were older, the damage of poverty had already taken effect in their brains. And okay. And it just shows you that, the study shows you that the problems are not with the families. I mean, they just needed, these families in the study just needed a little bit of a lift. And it didn't provide them with extra cash or didn't provide them with better jobs. It just moved them to a better neighborhood. And we saw these, very positive effects to children that then grew up in better circumstances. One outcome of poverty certainly can be homelessness. 1 in every 30 children in the U.S. is homeless. More than half of those are under the age of 6. Once again, it's going to harm younger children more. Homeless families share many stresses and risks in common with families living in poverty. Well, that makes sense. I mean, like there's a lot of the same risk factors. I mean, so for instance, uh, more chance of parental substance abuse, whether they're in poverty or homeless. I mean, more family violence or chance of family violence, more mental health issues within the family. Um, Also, though, but for those that are homeless, because they often have like temporary living arrangements where they might get to stay with some people for a little while, and then they might get to stay with some they might be at a shelter for a little while. They might often the families will be moving around while they're homeless, and children will often change schools then, which just contributes more to their problems if they're constantly switching schools. Also, siblings are more likely to get separated. Sometimes like because they're looking for places to stay. Sometimes like they might have relatives that can take one of the children, but not more, and so children may get separated, and this is obviously going to cause long-term issues within the family and in the sibling bonds. So there's added problems to being homeless as well as being in poverty. Homelessness is obviously a complex, multifaceted challenge for families. Comprehensive services are needed. There's no one quick answer, obviously. Uh, in order to help those families that are homeless, I mean, you need a lot of um, cheap or free services available to help them, get out of poverty, like inexpensive medical services that are available to them, substance recovery services for parents that have substance abuse issues, job training for those that need it, child care services, affordable housing options. It's once again, there's not one good answer, but you need to kind of build a infrastructure that can reach out and help and families um get these families you know to the point where they can support themselves and have a place to live. Okay, trauma. A traumatic event is one that a child either witnesses or is involved in that is perceived as extremely threatening. More than 2 out of every 3 children report experiencing at least one traumatic event before the age of 16. This includes such things as listed here: domestic violence, physical or sexual abuse, neglect, natural disasters, school violence, medical trauma, terrorism, refugee and war zone trauma. You could add a couple more things, like even something like severe motor vehicle accident is a traumatic event. Um, Suicides, by family members or friends, and are obviously very traumatic. Well, particularly if it's a family member, um, and even an unnatural death, of a parent or sibling. I mean, so trauma comes in many different forms. Um, some of the immediate reactions that we can expect among children. There's this list here. I don't have too much to add to it. Fear, separation anxiety, sleep disturbances or nightmares, loss of interest in normal activities, lack of concentration, anger, sadness, and somatic complaints such as stomachs or headaches. These are all, um, fairly common types of reactions among children. Um, in very serious cases, you may get longer term effects, including PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, which is when the individual re-experiences the traumatic event, through intrusive thoughts. So they constantly think about it, and they can't stop. Distressing dreams, flashbacks, and you would also expect extreme reactions in situations that are similar to the original trauma. So if the original trauma, let's just say, was something like a major motor vehicle accident, you can expect extreme reactions from children when they're back into a car again. So like if you if they're in situations that remind them, people with PTSD, I mean, this is when they're most vulnerable to the effects of PTSD. Okay, let's just keep going. How can we help children who have experienced trauma? Well, certainly parental support. That's obvious, and hopefully, sensitive, caring parental support of a child. For older children and adolescents, they could undergo cognitive behavioral therapy, which is where they teach them new like skills like relaxation skills, and they teach them how to cope and manage their stress so that they can learn to control it on their own. Obviously, I mean, they have to be of a certain age to for that type of training, learning strategies and skills to manage their stress. For younger children, they're more likely to use play therapy or art therapy. There's also school-based interventions available. And when I say young children, I'm talking about like preschoolers and kindergartners. One of the school-based interventions that's supposedly very good is called Head Start Trauma Smart. So it's like from the Head Start group. Head Start is like just high quality preschool education for disadvantaged families. Well, this is specifically for children that have experienced trauma. So the preschool classroom is full of teachers that have been trained to deal with trauma, and so it's a really great environment for a child that has experienced some kind of severe trauma early in life, because they're surrounded by the people that know what they're doing and can handle the problems that the children may experience because of the trauma that they were involved in or witnessed. It also brings children together because it's a specialized program. I mean, all the children there have experienced trauma in their lives, and so the children at a young age are finding out that other children are going through the same thing as them, and it's a really supportive type of system. This is a very specialized program, and it's hard to get into, and there's only so many spots available. But I've heard like very good things about it. Okay, child maltreatment. Just to define these terms, first of all, maltreatment refers to like both abuse and neglect. Okay? So it includes any act by parent or caregiver that results in harm or potential harm to a child, whether it's more on the abuse side or the neglect side. So maltreatment covers both. More specifically, abuse is deliberate and intentional words and actions that cause physical, sexual, or psychological harm or potential harm to a child. And the key words here are that it does need to be deliberate and intentional. I mean, accidentally harming a child does not count as abuse. Neglect is the failure to provide for basic physical, emotional, medical, or educational needs of a child, or failure to protect the child from harm or potential harm. And so neglect comes in many different forms. An underfed child, for instance, a child that doesn't have adequate clothing or to wear, a child that's not being made to go to school is a form of neglect. Not taking a child to a doctor when they need to go would be neglect, and or just lack of basic caretaking. Not making sure your child takes baths and is clean. I mean, like, so there's sometimes it's not like parents purposely trying to harm a child, but they're just, for one reason or another, they're very neglectful of the children, maybe because they're in poverty themselves and working, you know, long hours and whatnot, and leaving the children to fend on their own. And I mean, it's still neglect if the children aren't adequately being cared for, even if the parent's not, in this case, the parent doesn't have to be purposely or deliberately trying to neglect them. It's still neglect if it's happening. Okay. So back in the 1960s, there was a doctor by the name of Henry Kempe, Dr. Henry Kempe. Him and his colleagues identified and published, a paper about the battered child syndrome, and it was a big deal when it came out. A lot of people were shocked and amazed by their investigation and their report about how many children were considered battered children, and they detailed the types of damage that was done to children. And so anyways, it made a big splash when it first came out, and it eventually it kind of started the process and eventually led to this Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. People said something had to be done to reduce the number of battered children. So this was a very important act from 1974. It established a mechanism for reporting and tracking cases of suspected abuse or neglect to child protection agencies. So this act here helped to establish the idea of mandatory reporters. These are professionals who work with children and families, and they are required by law to report suspicions of child maltreatment to authorities. So no longer, could you just turn a blind eye to a child that you might be thinking, has been abused in some way or neglected. You're required, if you're working with the children, you're required to report it, even if it turns out that you're wrong. I mean, like, that's acceptable. They want you to report it, even if you're not unsure. And because since this has been set up, just let me give you a quick list first. I'm talking about, when I talk about professionals, this is like healthcare providers, so doctors, nurses, etc., pediatricians. This is also teachers at every level, child care providers, social workers, police officers would be in this group as well. So I mean, it could be, there's a wide range of different types of professionals that fall under this act, that are mandatory, and they are mandatory reporters. Since this was established, they say that now 3 out of every 5 reports typically come from these professionals who work with children and families, these mandatory reporters. So I mean, that's the majority of reports now are coming from them, because it's, if you just leave it up to, like, if you don't have the mandatory reporters, I mean, a lot of people don't want to be involved. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't want to take the trouble to report suspected cases of abuse or neglect, and this kind of puts the pressure on people. It's like it's your responsibility. Every report of suspected child abuse or neglect is investigated, but the majority of cases, in the majority of cases, they do not find that the children are victims of abuse or neglect. I'm just looking at my paper here. In less than 25% of the cases, do they find it's less than 25% of the cases, excuse me, they find victims of abuse or neglect, out of all the investigations they do. So, so it's only like, one of every four of the cases that are investigated actually ends up in a case of abuse or neglect. So, and this was the purpose of it, is like, you're not supposed to wait till you're absolutely sure. You're supposed to, have them investigate, and just to find out if, and it's better to err on the side of caution. And okay, let me go on here. Among reported cases of child maltreatment, I'm just going to go over these figures real quick here. This is from the U.S., and this was a 2013 report. So you can see about 80% of victims suffer from neglect. So that by far is the largest type of maltreatment. 18% suffered physical abuse, 9% sexual abuse, about 9% psychological maltreatment, about 2% medical neglect, and an additional 10% experienced other types of maltreatment. So, which would include things like abandonment or parental drug addiction. If you look at these numbers and you do any kind of quick calculations in your head, and you'll see that they do add up to greater than 100. And this is because, there are certainly cases involving more than one type of maltreatment. And so like one case, might be categorized in more than one category. So, maybe a child was neglected and abused. And so they would be in more than one category. So this is why the percentages add up to more than 100%. Because some things get classified more than once. Okay. I just thought I'd put this picture here. While I mentioned that a couple of stats here, on average, 4 children die each day as a result of abuse or neglect. And almost 3/4 of those involve children younger than the age of 3. Boy fatalities are almost double the girl fatalities. So 4 children dying per day, and most of them under the age of 3. Who perpetrates child maltreatment? Once again, this is from 2013. These figures, you can see it's about 91% of the time by a parent or parents, about 12.5% by a non-parent. So either another relative of the victim, group home staff member, daycare provider, foster parent. So once again, just to talk about the numbers real quick, it adds up to a little bit over 100%, because there are cases where there are more than one. There's more than one perpetrator, and you get them in each category. So just to give you an example, let's say a single mother, and maybe she has a male partner that's not a parent, and maybe they do some form of abuse or neglect together. So she would get categorized as a parent. He would be categorized in the second category. So sometimes you do get, more than one person charged, certainly. 86% of the time, when the charge is neglected, it's with women. So they by far get charged much more than men with neglect. Now, hopefully, if you think about that for a moment, it would make sense to you. Remember, in an earlier chapter, I told you that single parent families are the majority of the time are headed by women, and that they are often in very difficult financial situations. And so anyways, this is why there's more chance of neglect, or 86% of time neglect cases involve women, is because it's a woman, that's struggling to make ends meet. Once again, like I mentioned earlier, maybe working too many jobs, and leaving the child to fend by themselves because she can't afford, a daycare or childcare. Um, and so remember, neglect is, in many cases, it's not really purposeful. It's not a parent that's, purposely trying to harm the child. The neglect comes from just not being able to make ends meet. Um, for abuse, it's more often men. 62% of cases, um, it involves a man versus a woman. Higher reported levels in lower income families. And one, I've already kind of mentioning that, you get a lot more of the neglect, for instance, in lower income families, because they just don't have the resources to properly care for the children always. Uh, there's a lot more stress, as it says here, in lower income families, um, which can increase, abuse as well. With more stress can lead to more frustration and aggression and angry outbursts and things like that. Um, so part of it is that it's the situation, which causes more reported levels in lower income families. The other part is that there might be a reporting bias, meaning that they're just more likely to be reported to authorities. Well, one reason is mentioned here. They have higher contact with mandatory reporting agencies. So low income families are often involved in different kinds of programs. Um, they may be using social services. They would be like much more than a middle income family, let's say. And so they are bound to come across people that may be mandatory reporters, much more so than a family that has more money. And secondly, it's not listed here, but another thing that can contribute to the reporting bias is that people are just generally more likely to report a poorer family to Child Protective Services, than a richer family. Um, it's like if you are, if somebody sees somebody that looks neglected or abused in a poor area, I mean, they often just kind of assume that's probably true. But if this happens like in a middle class neighborhood, people often turn a blind eye to such things. They may know that they have a neighbor that sometimes hits a kid or whatnot, but they're less likely to get involved, less likely to report them. And so you do get the reporting bias, just that and so some of the abuse and neglect that goes on in more middle class or richer families may often go unreported. One more thing I want to add here is that among parents who had been abused as children themselves, about 30% perpetuate the cycle and become abusive parents. So those that had been, abused while as children, then when they became parents, about 30% of them perpetuate the cycle. And it's just, this is part of what I've discussed in earlier parts of the book, where we form certain kinds of mental models about how life works and what's appropriate, and we, during childhood, and in particular, we form these mental models. And if your experience growing up was to be abused in one form or one way or another, that becomes part of your mental model of what parents do and what parents can do, at least. And it just makes it more likely that you will repeat the pattern. I mean, we often copy our parents, I mean, for good things or for bad things. We often copy what we learned growing up. Until we really make an effort to be different. It's kind of our first instinct is like to react the way you know, I would react the way my father would have reacted, or if you're a woman, you react the way your mother would have reacted when you were a kid, and because that's what we know about parenting. We learned it growing up, and so those that were abused, well, part of their model says that this is okay or it's appropriate. Um, okay, impacts of abuse and neglect. Um, let's start with sexual abuse. As it says here, I mean, the results are pretty clear. It's been associated with physical health problems, as well as higher rates of depression, anxiety disorders, antisocial behavior, substance abuse, attempted suicides. So the research has been clear about the negative effects associated with sexual abuse. And there's a whole list of them. But what might be surprising, and one of the things too is that makes it, particularly um, particularly cause some kind of mental health issues is that most of them are victimized by somebody that they know, right? And this just makes it that much worse, and and causes a lot of psychological issues. Um, but here's the thing: the outcomes of physical abuse and neglect are not as clear. Um, I mean, physical abuse is still a very, very bad thing, but there's been conflict in research results. And just to mention one, this study found that when other life experiences that are associated with negative mental health outcomes are controlled, so if you control for things like, well, we know that poverty causes problems, and we know that I don't know, growing up in poor neighborhoods can cause problems, and growing up with if your parents have mental health issues, that we like there's a lot of variables that we already know that can cause developmental problems. And so they say, well, if you control those, like, because often when physical abuse happens, it's in those situations. It's more likely in a poverty situation, for instance. If you control those, they have found that the relationship between childhood physical abuse and mental health outcomes becomes insignificant, meaning that the actual physical abuse isn't really adding on that much compared to what they're already experiencing. It's insignificant. So like it. So there's enough other bad stuff that's more significant, causing problems, that the physical abuse is is not actually contributing to their mental health problems. Okay, I hope that makes some sense. But so I mean, I found that a surprising result when I read it the first time. Um, okay. The other thing I want to mention is psychological and emotional abuse. Those forms of abuse are the most difficult to define and the most difficult to investigate. Because there's no actual physical evidence of the harm done, those get like studied and investigated the least. It's hard to prove that somebody experienced psychological abuse. I mean, we know it goes on, or emotional abuse. I mean, once again, we know that these things go on, but those are the cases that are least likely um, to be collaborated in investigations, because you just can't say ever for sure if somebody has been psychologically or emotionally abused, and unless there's a recording of it. Whereas, like with physical or sexual abuse, there's actual evidence that you can find of those things. Um, okay, and finally, inadequate parenting, domestic violence, poverty, and abuse often occur together, multiplying the amount of stress in a child's life. As I was kind of mentioning when I was talking about the physical abuse, there's all these other things that often go along with it. Inadequate, like the child's already has inadequate parenting. There's domestic violence within the home that they witness. They're growing up in poverty, and so this is why they say that the abuse ends up not being some the physical abuse at least ends up being an insignificant factor because they have all these other factors they're already dealing with. These things often are grouped together. We know that this is the most likely scenario for abuse is when you have this mixture within a household. Okay. Okay, moving on to the last topic of this video in this section. Racial stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So I like this definition here. Racism is being defined here as a pervasive system of advantage based on race. And I like that they use the word system. Some people think of racism as something that happens among certain people. And it's not it's not the way to look at it. I mean, racism is embedded in our society. It is part of the makeup of our society, and that certain groups receive all sorts of advantages much more than other groups. And this would be, everything from like how you're evaluated and treated by teachers, how the police interact and evaluate you, and how, your chances of getting loans at the bank. And, it's a system. It affects so many different levels. So it's not about like there's a racism is a bunch of individuals who cause problems. It is society being a whole system within society being disadvantaging certain people. And it's important to understand that, so you don't think, well, you don't be one of those people that just says, well, I'm not racist, so I have nothing to do with it. Well, the truth is that, in a sense, we all have something to do with it because we're all part of the same society and the same systems. And being a white male, I had a lot of advantages that a lot of other people didn't have. And not, not that I don't remember doing anything, wrong in my life, but it's important to understand that just because of the things like the color of your skin, certain people have advantages that others don't. And so that's why I think it's important that they use the word system. It's a system of advantage. It's not just about some bad apples or some bad individuals. There are three aspects of racism. Stereotypes, well, these are something that we all have. So this doesn't make you racist. Everyone has stereotypes. You can't help it. Stereotypes are a type of schema. We form schemas naturally as we learn things, as we are exposed to different facts or beliefs or ideas in society. I mean, we form schemas about everything. So we also form schemas about people, which we call stereotypes, and you can't help but learn them because they're once again a lot of these stereotypes are just embedded in society, like within the media, for instance. If you watch enough TV growing up, you're going to learn a bunch of stereotypes. Oh, this is what Jewish people were like. This is what African American people were like. Oh, this is what Hispanic people were like. I mean, because TV is full of stereotypes, and so we gain certain beliefs. Okay, having a stereotype does not make you bad. Okay, it's okay that it's like, yeah, I've got certain stereotypes. There's certain race, for instance, I think that are really good at math. I'm not going to say which one, but it's a stereotype. It's not going to be true of everyone, every member of that particular race or ethnicity, but it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. I mean, I don't know. I think being good at math is a positive quality, but it's still a stereotype. And I may never act on it. I may never express it. I'm saying something here in the video, but It's an idea that comes once again often from just racial stereotyping within media, whether it's movies or shows or cartoons or anything. Okay, so stereotypes, everyone understand. We all have them. We have stereotypes about age groups, right? You might have stereotypes about old people. If you think that they're slow drivers, that's a stereotype. And it doesn't matter even if even if it may often be true, it's certainly not true of every old person. And okay, so stereotypes are natural, so I want to just make sure that's clear. Now, as we move down this list, things get worse. Prejudices, well, yeah, now we're entering into kind of a worse thing because now you're having an attitude, a negative attitude towards members of that group. And I would put those words in it. It says negative attitudes about that group. Well, what prejudice really is negative attitudes towards members of that group. So it's not just like no longer are you just thinking of the group as a whole, but like some you meet, you see one person that belongs to this certain ethnic group, for instance, and if you have a negative attitude towards that person without knowing them, that's prejudice. So prejudice is an attitude, and even if you don't act on it, if you think and you apply it to an individual, then it's gone beyond a stereotype. So once again, you might have stereotypes where that you apply to a whole group. Oh, this is what I've heard about this group. These people have this, or these people are this, but then if you start applying it in a negative way to individuals, then it becomes prejudice. Discrimination is even worse because now it's not that you just have a negative attitude that might just be in your head, but now you're actually engaging in negative behavior. So now you're doing something that's directed, and once again, put in the words directed towards members of that group, because you're not just discriminating against the whole group. You're discriminating towards one individual at a time. That's when it's really discrimination. It's like just because somebody you believe belongs to a certain race, it's like not only do you have a negative attitude, but now you've decided not to hire them for your job, for instance, that you advertise for. Right away, you throw their application in the trash just because of their particular ethnicity. Well, that was obviously discrimination. Or you treat them differently, or if you're a police officer and you stop them, you treat them differently, or it's somebody, I don't know, somebody that works under you and you don't give them the same benefit of the doubt. Or if you're a professor and you grade somebody differently because of their ethnicity, I mean, that's obviously discrimination. So you're actually acting towards individuals of the group because of your negative attitudes. And so like these build on each other. The stereotypes, we all have them. They're not so bad because you don't have to apply them. Even though you know them, you don't have to apply them to individuals. When you get up to prejudice, and now you're directing negative attitudes towards individuals of a group, and then if you start acting on them, you've moved to discrimination, and which is obviously even worse because it's going to have a direct effect on others. Racism may be overt or covert. So overt just means openly accepted and acted on. So when somebody's overtly racist, it's like they're not even trying to hide it. It's like they know it's just like it's just out there. They're not doing it accidentally. They don't. They say they're not afraid to show it. Overt is certainly worse than covert, but covert is a more widespread issue. Covert is like unconscious or implicit racism. And in the case of covert racism, an individual may not even be aware that they have racist attitudes, but it's still affecting them. So like there are people, and the studies have shown that people that completely believe that they never have they don't have no racism in them, they never act on the racism, and then there have been studies done that just show that they still treat people differently based on their race, and so it's quite possible to be unaware of racist attitudes and beliefs, and yet it still affects your behavior. So, like, you may be thinking you're completely fair, and let's say you're looking at two job applicants, and you're just reading over their files, and one of them has a foreign sounding name, and like you may not consciously think anything about it, but it may be that, like, maybe their skills are really close, and it's almost like a coin flip, and so you pick like Bob Smith instead of, I don't know, I don't want to make up a name, but some race, let's say some um, ethnic sounding name. It's like, and it may not be a conscious choice, but what studies show is that this is what covert racism is that it's really like unconscious kind of racism, and it's what we found in these studies is that it's very, very widespread, and that it actually had trouble finding anyone that didn't have some form of unconscious racism. So this is the problem, is that when you, just by growing up in a certain society, even if all of your intentions are good, you could still be affected with this unconscious kind of racism based on, just based on the information you've been fed growing up and all the TV you've watched and what your parents might have said and one thing or another. And so it's still much better to to consciously try to be fair. They say that people can kind of combat their unconscious racism if they keep making efforts to always, to actually not let it affect them. So it's good to be aware of that you might have it, that anyone might have it, unconscious racism, and so you make special efforts to make sure that it never affects how you treat others. Okay, I'm probably talking too much here, but let's go on. Okay, impacts of racism. For it says adolescents. Make sure you add children in there. For both children and adolescents, the experience of racism is linked with lower levels of self-esteem, higher levels of depression and anxiety, and conduct disorders, things such as substance abuse or violence. Um, Both parental support and racial socialization improve the outcomes for children who have experienced racial discrimination. Um, Racial socialization is when minority parents make efforts to specifically teach your children about discrimination, in order to prepare them to deal with these experiences, and they teach them to take pride in their heritage. And they've found that this is very helpful, um, when minority children are growing up, if their parents have done this form of racial socialization. It's like preparing them for the world. This is what you might experience, and like explicitly kind of teaching them this. It's unfortunate that it has to happen, but it's better to prepare them than have them not be prepared. And what I've heard is that a lot, that at least I I can't say I've talked to a lot of people about it, but the ones I have, like, that it is fairly common, at least among the people I've spoken to, about, yeah, we prepared our children, like when I've talked to racial parents, ethnic parents, not racial, ethnic parents, a lot of them do make very special efforts to teach their children what it's going to be like growing up. Okay, just one more slide in this section. And these are about some of the school-based interventions available to help educate others about racism and discrimination and prejudice. The least effective of these three mentioned here is multicultural education. It's the least effective. I mean, it's not a bad thing by any means, but it doesn't do a lot to curb prejudice or discrimination. And multicultural education is like when children get introduced to positive ideas about racial or ethnic groups other than their own. Meaning, like it's kind of like let's say there's a unit at school, like during Black History Month, they point out some great Black inventors and politicians or from the past or scientists or like, and then okay, that's interesting. Like and they kind of teach you they want to expose the kids to some of these some of these other ethnicities and and it's like it's like I said, it's not a bad thing. It just studies show that it doesn't really do a lot to curb people's initial ideas. Um, so it's not really it doesn't really affect prejudice and discrimination too much. Um, these next these last two are more effective and more direct. The anti-bias social cognitive skills training. This focuses specifically on prejudice and discrimination. So it's not just like, oh, let's teach you about this great Black scientist or something. I mean, like, it's like they teach the children about prejudice and discrimination. What does it mean? How does it show up? And then this program promotes role taking skills and it promotes empathy. So they have students, play different roles so they get to experience like in their role playing, like what it's like to have somebody discriminate against you or to be prejudiced against you. And so it does help them learn empathy towards others. And then cooperative learning experiences has been shown to be effective when it's done right. This involves encouraging interaction among children of different races and backgrounds by having them work together on the learning project. So this is like this has been called a jigsaw classroom before. You might have I think that might have come up in an earlier chapter, but so you put together groups in the classroom where you have members of different races and backgrounds and within each group, and they have to work together in order to succeed on a project. And so just the exposure of working with one of your peers that's of a different ethnicity and doing a project over time with them, they just show this helps children develop positive ideas towards other ethnicities, um, just by interacting with them. And it's like, yeah, this is my friend Joey, like he's cool, and it was okay. So those are called cooperative learning experiences. And that will conclude video 4 from chapter sorry, I'm all over the place here. Video 4 from chapter 15.